All right, cool. I think we're good.
All right, sweet.
All right, then my name is Connor. I run a YouTube channel named Counterpoints. Should I just call you Adam for the sake of the conversation? Do you mind if I use your full name?
Adam Rice is fine. Adam Rice, whatever you want.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for being here with me, bud. Basically, you reached out a while back and kind of said that like modern monetary theory or modern economics is something that you were interested in, studied, all that kind of stuff, and it's probably one of my weakest subjects. Like, I understand like basic economics. I took business classes in college, but especially with the modern stuff, I get really scared really
Yep.
fast. and and I was hoping you could alleviate some of my anxieties, or at least explain to me what the current theories are. So, can you take it from there and kind of introduce yourself to people at home?
Yeah, for sure. So I studied economics in college. After college, so I graduated 2012. Um, After the 2016 election, I think like a lot of people, I got really into politics. Started really getting into Bitcoin, trying to understand all the Bitcoin world, trying to understand all the stuff you see on YouTube, gold standard stuff, etc. Um, and in reading about Bitcoin, etc., and cryptocurrencies, I came across modern monetary theory, MMT, and I basically said, holy shit, this changes my whole perspective on how the government works, on how economics works, and I think it's important that everyone understands this stuff. So I started a podcast. The podcast is called Pocket Change. I haven't recorded in a while, but I did 10 or 12 episodes maybe, mostly with academics, some people that work for the Fed, etc. And I have not done it in a while because I found that the issue is if you have an MMT focused podcast, you're really only reaching people who already know about MMT.
Mm.
My goal with the podcast is to reach people like your audience who might not be familiar with it, some people who might be opposed to it, etc. And my goal with the stream tonight is to just kind of get people familiar with MMT who might not be, and just go over, very high level what it is, and hopefully answer some questions on what it is.
Okay, cool. And then maybe I can explain. I'm just going to tweet it out so people know that live. But
Sure.
don't fret. People do um, watch post stuff too, and basically, I would mind highlighting maybe some of my obvious fears and anxieties about MT, and just kind of like my understanding of at least how money works in the modern day, at least as far as I understand it.
Yep.
So my understanding was kind of it's very simple. But back in the day, like I don't know, like Middle Ages basically, we used to have gold and silver, but
Mm.
that was kind of crappy to to basically transport. So while it was actually individually valuable, notes became used as representations of value. And then eventually what happened is people said like, okay, well, why don't we just use the notes? Because like, this is basically, it's representative of some level of value. We can use it as a form of exchange. And these notes have taken on their own definition. So why don't we just trade the notes instead of literally lugging silver and gold back and forth for people to transfer? And then I would say that that kind of exchange in currency and value system lasted, I want to say, up until the 20th century. And then in the 20th century, people basically said, like, well, silver and gold and raw goods that we tie value to are not the only things worth caring about. So why don't we just make the currency representative of general value in the market? And then that way we can kind of print money in proportion with the economy, and then that way we can kind of expand what human beings can do with their money, whether that's fighting war, expanding portions of the economy, investing in infrastructure, and all that kind of stuff. And then I guess I can leave it there, but I do have the scary shit in the back of my head that I would like to get into as well. So how do you like that as a
Yeah.
summary so far?
So that's pretty solid. I would say that so yeah, the conventional money story as you typically would learn it in like a college class, or like the history of money, is pretty close to that.
Mhm.
And MMT differs a little bit. So typical money story would be, okay, there's human beings out in the wild. One human being might have cows and one human being might have apples, and it's hard for them to exchange those one for one. So they agree on some kind of currency, say it's gold, could be seashells, whatever it is, and that is kind of the medium of exchange. It becomes the medium of exchange. Um, what MMT says, and this is via like history, anthropology, etc. There's a great book on this called Debt by David Graeber, who he passed away a few months ago. Is that all money is basically just an IOU, whether it's gold, whether it's silver, whether it's seashells, etc. So if I have a piece of gold and I give it to you, that's just satisfying an IOU. So like all money is just a debt. It doesn't matter what the object being exchanged is, what the money object being exchanged is. So the U.S. dollar is just debt. It's debt of an issuer. So the more IOUs you have, the more you're able to spend and satisfy those debts, basically.
Okay, and then this kind of gets into the fear and anxiety, I guess, which I think we've
Yep.
all heard of the pre-Nazi Germany. I forget what they were called. Oh, the Weimar Republic, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And some of the
Yep.
most like
That's right.
famous photos in the world when it comes to concepts like inflation is basically
Yep.
citizens of the Weimar Republic literally hauling wheelbarrows of cash. To
Yep.
the grocery store and to the tax collector and to this person and that person, basically because if I understand correctly, the printing had gotten out of control, so they
Mhm.
basically just created so much currency that ultimately the debt representation of that IOU as a note wasn't worth anything because they hadn't done it in correspondence with actual value. And then I think that's
Right.
the fear that we have is when we look at countries like Venezuela or other leftist countries where they seem to take on similar relationships to fiscal policy. I think Greece is another example that's brought up as like somebody who has a bad fiscal relationship. The fear is
Yep.
that once you just start printing money endlessly, ultimately the definitions of that IOU become useless, and then people start
Yep.
treating that currency like it doesn't mean anything, and then that actually fucks people because then if you have tens of thousands of dollars, but it's not worth the paper that it's printed on, then exchanging that for a loaf of bread kind of fucks you. And people have starved and died because of this phenomena. So
Yep.
how does MMT change the game, change the definitions, or change perceptions of this dynamic?
So in I think the examples when people first hear about MMT, their head goes exactly kind of where what you just mentioned, which is Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar Republic, etc. In the case of each of these, if you look at what was actually happening in those economies, there was a lot more going on than just the government printing money. In Weimar's case, there were massive like war reparations that they owed. A lot of it was tied to gold. Their resources had been destroyed. That was the case in Zimbabwe as well, where basically like their entire food production had like the whole supply chain had been destroyed. And the printing of money usually comes after the fact. So the printing of money happened after the real economy had been destroyed,
Hmm.
and the government printed money to make up for it. So that was more of a consequence than the actual cause of the hyperinflation. Venezuela, you really have to look at these case by case. In Venezuela, again, it wasn't just like the printing of money that caused this issue. It was that they had debts that basically they had debt denominated in the U.S. dollar. So the U.S. dollar is not something the Venezuelan government can control, and pegging a currency can have massive effects on the whole real economy. Same with Greece, right? So Greece, you know, 15 years ago, the academics involved in kind of formulating MMT were saying that the eurozone was going to be a disaster because Greece does not control their currency. They don't control the euro. The European Central Bank does. They're just users of that currency. It's kind of like a relationship that a state in the United States has with the federal government, where the states can't create US dollars like the federal government can. So if they owe US dollars, they have to find a way to get those US dollars. And that's the situation in Greece, where if Greece owes, people that own Greek bonds, if Greece owes lira to those people, Greece owes, I'm sorry, euros to those people. Greece can't just like summon those euros. It can't just credit accounts, which is what the U.S. government does.
Yeah, so I guess that's the. But I was actually thinking about this the other day, actually, like the other month when we first started talking, because I was trying to wrap my head around how maybe it was possible to have the economy perpetuate itself regardless of the value of the paper currency or the digital currency that existed. And I was thinking to myself, it's
Yep.
like oftentimes South Park, believe it or not, actually did an episode on this when they came to like the 2007 debt crisis, where they were basically saying that
Hmm.
like debt is ultimately about like consumer confidence and participation in the economy. So if people put on a leap of faith that their
Yep.
productive energy was going to be utilized and they were going to be able to exchange that for a service or something like that, then at some point this does become I don't want to say arbitrary, but a little bit arbitrary. So that is the thing that I was about. It's like, well, I mean, if the United States government prints $10 trillion tomorrow, but everybody continues to show up to work and everybody works and
Yep.
everybody I can hear you, buddy. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. I think the
Yeah. No
internet
worries.
conked out. I'll go back live again.
No worries.
Fucking technology, dude. What a pain in the balls. I can't wait to get
I
fucking
know.
rich and just buy my way into good technology.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff is still never perfect.
Yeah. All right, 1 second. Going live again. And I feel like I just asked the most important question.
That was a good question.
Yeah. If YouTube chat can hear me, hello. I'll just type that shit. Say hello, you dirtbags, and then we'll keep talking. So basically, I was saying before we got interrupted by the internet technical issues. Sorry for that, everybody who's watching. But basically, I was asking like if people continue with economically productive activity and then the government prints endless amounts of money, what's like the new perspective on that relationship?
Yeah. So I mean, the whole gist of MMT, and people, like, a lot of people will straw man it online and say, oh, you just want the government to print endless amounts of money, and that's obviously not what MMT proponents are saying.
Mm-hmm.
We're saying that when it comes to budgetary decisions, fiscal decisions, you shouldn't look at the dollar amount. So if the government's going to spend, $2 trillion on, let's say it is infrastructure. Let's say the government says we're going to spend $2 trillion on high-speed rail, on high-speed internet, on 5G, whatever you name it. It's really not the dollar amount that we should be so concerned with when it comes to, you know, uh, inflation, etc. It's the real resources in the economy. So there are certain things that, sure, if you spent $1 trillion on, if the government spent $1 trillion hiring engineers, let's say like rocket scientists, you would probably see inflation in the market for rocket scientists.
Hmm.
But if the government created $1 trillion and, um, shot it into space, or the government created $1 trillion and buried it, or the government created $1 trillion and spent it in Africa for development, that would have much, much different real world effects. So the core of MMT is kind of looking at okay, we know we can create the money. We know we issue the currency. We know we can spend the currency into existence. We do spend the currency into existence whenever the government spends. What you should be looking at is what effect does that have on the real economy? The quantity of money alone isn't enough to know what's going to happen.
Yeah, so I guess that's my concern, or the concern of everybody else. So I think that's the perfect example. Basically generating revenue for folks in Africa to develop their own infrastructure or even domestic infrastructure, right? So let's say
Yep.
that we spend it on real hard goods, or we spend it in a foreign country, and then that money gets like circulated into the global economy or the domestic economy. But then
Yep.
there's at the end of the day, there's real hard goods. There's people who have been paid, and they've been paid a
Yep.
fraction of that. But then those real hard goods now exist, and on top of that, like I was a property accountant for a while.
Yep.
Basically, it's like those goods exist. They have a certain amount of transferable value. They depreciate over time, and like for instance, like a bridge. Like who the fuck is going to buy a bridge, right? Like all you've done is you've built like a hard infrastructure that hopefully will last generations. But that some
Yep.
of that value is sunk into the equipment you purchased in order to buy it, that then depreciates itself and then is ultimately destroyed and all of that kind of stuff. So my fear when we do this is like if we take on too many projects at once, let's say that literally tomorrow Joe Biden is like, hey, I can print however much money I want. $10 trillion to Africa, $10 trillion into local infrastructure, $14 trillion
Yep.
for reparations, and $3 trillion because I feel like it. Everybody gets fourth rounds of stimulus. Then what would prevent
Yep.
people who hold on to like U.S. bonds or hold on to U.S. currency? What would keep them from saying like they're devaluing what I invested into this paper currency, therefore I'm going to bail?
Okay. Well, there's a few things there. I think so. For sure, Biden. Let's say Biden did have the power to do that. He could screw up the whole system, 100%. I think it's like that is a very extreme scenario. We obviously like no one wants Biden to do that and spend $30 trillion willy nilly. I think it's more about recognizing what is possible, and it's also possible to spend too little. That's like another big piece here, and I think that's actually the bigger concern. In terms of keeping faith in the dollar, so the reason the dollar, like, a key point of MMT is that taxes drive the currency. So the reason that people need dollars is because everyone has to pay taxes in dollars, and that's coercive, right? So the reason that everyone uses dollars in the U.S. is because every U.S. citizen has to pay taxes in dollars, or else they're going to jail, or they're getting fined, or whatever. All contracts are denominated in dollars for that reason. All fines are denominated in dollars for that reason. And that's what drives the dollar. That's like what causes what created adoption of the dollar in the first place. It also, the government has pricing power. So like as the monopolist of the dollar, it's the only entity and its agents, meaning banks, can they're the only ones that can create dollars. And because of that, they have pricing power over the dollar. So they're setting, I'm trying to think of an example of this. But basically, the value of a given unit is essentially what the government will pay for it. And this is very complex, but taxes drive money is essentially the answer to that. And yes, we can definitely be afraid that politicians might take this too far. I think that's a real concern. But we also have to keep in mind, and this has happened in the real world. This happened after 2008. That fear of spending and fear of the national debt, which was totally unfounded, prolonged the Great Recession way longer than it had to go. And I think that is a more realistic fear than Joe Biden, spending $50 trillion tomorrow.
Well, so basically what I'm hearing is like not that we now have access to unlimited spending and we can do whatever the fuck we want. But
Yeah.
basically as long as we maintain faith in the currency and the economy, then we can strike a better balance than we are right now and maybe do more than we think. And
Yes.
so basically my follow-up question on that was I was alarmed after the most recent round of spending when I want to say in like April or May, we did see like inflation around like 4% or something like that, and I think the target is like 2.5 or something like that, like over time.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
I don't know, I don't even know if that's corrected because I literally saw like the one story. But then like that's kind of my concern is do we understand these mechanisms well enough that we know when too much is too much and when too little is too little? Like do we understand these forces?
Yeah. So I think that's the big question, right? And there's a few things to keep in mind there, but I agree with you that managing inflation is probably not as easy as we think it is. But a lot more than just like what the government is spending goes into inflation. So, for example, banks are creating money through loans all the time. Like it's not just the government that's creating dollars via issuance via spending. Spending power is created all the time. Like if Chase issues a $30,000 credit card to somebody, that's $30,000 of spending. And that is not always what drives inflation, and neither is the quantity of money. So just like you can't look and I think a lot of this inflation talk is overblown. Like I think a lot of this stuff was due to supply chain issues and just like general macroeconomic weirdness from COVID. Um, and a lot of times, the financial media will try to say, oh, it's the quantity of money, it's the government spending, it's all this stuff, but there are a million factors that go into this. There's supply chain shortages that might cause price increases. There's, pent up demand. There's all kinds of things, and I think everyone, and this is mostly due to Milton Friedman, which we can go into if you want. But this comes back to the belief that like the driving force in the price level is the quantity of money, which Milton Friedman falsely said that the government, can control on its own, essentially, which isn't true. So I think,
yeah, I had a question there because
yep,
basically I've been through two massive world calamities, economic calamities.
yep,
One of them
yep,
being COVID, the other one being the housing crisis of 2007. And kind of what
yep,
I remember during the 2007 crash or whatever was basically like it seemed like nothing had changed on the ground.
hmm
Like nothing had
hmm
changed on the fucking ground. Like people were still working minimum wage jobs, people were still showing up, people were still getting paid, like all that kind of stuff. But for some fucking reason, it was just like the economy had just like a hemorrhage money, and people who used to
yep,
have it, and people who used to didn't. And then every financial institution and every business basically like
yep,
kind of like a body in shock, like sucked all the blood to the core, it like as like
yep,
a self protection mechanism. But then I kind of what I kind of thought of, because I've studied like medical stuff for a little bit, was that looking at like stimulus or covering the debts or whatever could kind of be like a blood transfusion, where if somebody goes into shock, then you give them, you don't say don't give him more blood because you don't want to overwhelm his system. You say give him
yep,
blood, that way he can maintain circulation, that way we can get everything moving again. And that's kind of the way
yep,
that I've looked at the past two economic crises whenever there's been a stimulus or a debt consolidation, is basically like the federal government being like, okay, this was fucked up. Like we have a body that's in shock. Let's go ahead and do a blood transfusion and give it maybe like a paddle shock in order to get everything moving again.
yeah. I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it. I'll say, so I think the fiscal response in after 2008 was totally insufficient. So
Insufficient.
it started as a crisis in the yes, yeah, in
that's
in
that's
in '08.
amazing
I'm
because
talking about in '08.
everything I heard from Fox News was the opposite.
Well, exactly. Well, so it's interesting because and I think we'll see what happens with Biden. But in 2008, you had a crisis that started in the financial sector, and we can talk about why it started from an MMT lens. But basically, households, financial institutions became way over leveraged, so they were borrowing way too much money, often to buy homes. And then there were the mortgage-backed securities. Those instruments became worthless because people could no longer service their debt. When those instruments became worthless, banks started to fail, and then like that eventually rippled into the real economy. And what you were just describing, it was what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. So like if the whole economy stops spending money at one time, if everyone is saving and everyone's trying to deleverage, then no one has any income, right? So if I'm not spending, then the store next to me doesn't have any income. If the store next to me doesn't have any income, then their employees don't have any income to spend. And so you get into like this deflationary spiral. So typically what the government will do, and what they did in '08, not to a sufficient degree, and what they did recently, which was better, was they injected money via deficit spending into the economy. So in '08, if you look at what happened, I think the right kind of used the national debt and the deficits as a vehicle to not get Obama, to prevent Obama from spending, and he bought in. But basically, if you look what happened, the administration started doing a stimulus, the economy started ticking up, and then they just kind of stopped, and it fizzled out, and the unemployment rate was pretty stagnant. I mean, it improved, but like it was a very, very slow recovery. And the unemployment rate didn't get back, till to full employment until I think the end of Trump's term. And Trump, interestingly enough, all the deficit shit went out the window when Trump became president. All you never heard about the deficit, you never heard about the national debt,
Oh, dude, Republicans don't
right?
give a fuck
But
about
he
that
was,
shit.
I know.
Rhetorically,
But
they give a
the
fuck about it,
what
but they
was
don't actually give a fuck about it.
exactly but what was causing that boom? What caused like all the high level economic metrics to be pretty good was the deficit spending. Um, because if deficit increases, then like aggregate economic activity, aggregate demand is going to increase. So it seems like with COVID that the government was, that the whole public I think was less willing to jump into like the national debt shit, the deficit stuff, and they responded with a larger fiscal response that kept the economy on its feet. But I don't think we're out of the woods yet with it. And I think like there will be consequences if the government, like they're tapering fiscal support. If you look at between this time, I think this time last year versus now, it's down something like 120 billion year over year.
Well,
So it's something to watch for.
And I want to ask about that because the calculus that I think that they're trying to balance, and maybe this is where the old perspectives are clashing with the new perspectives, is
Yep.
that like basically we've given enough money to float people during the
Yep.
COVID crash, but now that the people who want to be immunized are immunized, and the people who don't want to be immunized aren't immunized. It's time to basically rip out the social safety net. That way, people get back to work, and if people get, evicted in the meantime, if people don't get, paid, if utility companies basically forfeit like 6 months of pay, it is what it is because people have to get back to work and start being economically productive. So
Yep.
so I think that's the rationale as far as I understand it. And then I wanted to ask another question about deflationary spirals. From like a narrative
Yep.
standpoint, is that kind of what happened? When you say that, I kind of think of that historically within the realm of the Great Depression,
Mhm.
where basically everybody and their mom, all of a sudden didn't have money, but then they all pulled back, and then because they all pulled back, they weren't able to spend, and because they weren't able to spend, and because the government wasn't doing any stimulus at that time, because I don't even think they knew about it conceptually. Basically, it came, if I understand economics or historical economics correctly, it was really like FDR's New Deal and World War II that was kind of like the
Yep.
wealth transfer that kickstarted the American economy back into function, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the things FDR did was he suspended the gold standard. So the gold standard basically it limited government spending to like dollars in existence were exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold, right? So I don't know what it was exactly. I think it was $35. You could exchange at any time for an ounce of gold. So that obviously limited government spending to the amount of gold they had in the gold reserves. FDR suspended the gold standard in the New Deal era. Nixon took us off the gold standard entirely in the early 70s. But yes, so there was I believe Keynes coined the term deflationary spiral to describe what was going on during the Depression, and that people were too afraid. Everyone wanted to save suddenly, and because everyone wanted to save suddenly, no one had any income, right? So that's the issue you run into. So what what FDR did with the New Deal, and this is what we could be doing today, if in my opinion, if we were smart about it, was they basically industrialized the United States. Like they electrified the South, they built tons of public schools, they built tons of post offices, they built highways, they built, you know, you name it, tons of public works, arts, etc. And is there going to be some wasteful spending in there? Absolutely. Is there going to be some fraud in there? Absolutely. But the aggregate effect of that, like he developed the United States, and now I think we're in a similar place. And I was actually surprised. I thought there was a chance Trump would do this because he could call it Trump 5G and Trump Rail and all this stuff. But we're in a place where
He lacks
the economy needs fiscal stimulus.
yeah, he lacks vision. He could have been the right wing FDR, and he could have named Trump Rail, Trump Canal, Trump the yeah, you
Yes,
could have gotten fucking wild with
totally.
it. Yeah. Well, and so
Totally. He could have. I mean,
mhm. Well, I was going to ask, like, so
so
the what do you
go
think
ahead.
the United States needs in order to move into the future? Because oftentimes, like, I think uh I'm blinded by the technological advances of the past like 30 years. So
Yep.
when I was born, the landline was like, I don't know, maybe like 20, 30 years old, something like that, at least for like for
Yep.
common people, like 70 years. Like, I'm sure Alexander Graham Bell had a functioning telephone in 1910, but I'm just saying, like,
Yep.
as far as like it being mass produced, mass available, all that kind of stuff, and going from a landline in the home that was only for voice to basically like uh, literally a fucking supercomputer in my hand, that is
Yep.
hooked into a wireless network, and also the speed of the internet, like, being so insane that we can do
Yep.
this now, this conversation.
Yep.
It's fucking nuts. And so I don't even
It is nuts.
know what the economy of the future needs or what we need to invest into, because like I'm
Yep.
blinded by what's already happened, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, but I think uh, airports is an easy example. Like, why are airports terrible? Infrastructure, like constantly, and this, I don't know what parties are at play here, what lobbies are at play here, but roads, bridges, that type of thing. It seems like we could use a massive improvement in schools. 5G is something that it doesn't seem like there's a national strategy for. High speed rail. People talk about a Green New Deal, that type of thing, like solar energy, wind energy, just alternative energy that we could be investing in. And
Could
they're
we just
trying to
like
do this. And
could
so what?
could we just rename it to like the New Deal brought to you by like Monster Energy or something? Because like I'm pretty sure like that would do better. Like
That would
Green New
sell it. That would
Deal.
sell it better.
It sounds like hippies. It
Yeah,
sounds like
I know.
environmentalism. It sounds like caring about trees and seals and turtles, and that's all pussy shit.
Right. I
But if you
agree.
say New
Right. I don't.
Deal by Monster Energy, then you basically know that like you're gonna crack open like a white Monster Energy at 7 in the morning, and then like kick like an endangered tortoise in the face on the way to your truck, and then that's how we get this passed. Like, I think that's
That might
optically
work.
better.
I
Okay,
mean, maybe if Trump had called it Trump's New Deal, I mean, maybe he could have gotten something done.
right.
Um, but I think, yeah, no, I think that there's a branding problem. But like you look at what the Democrats are trying to do now, like with Biden's infrastructure. And here's the enlightening part of MMT, I think. So I think the plan is something around a trillion, maybe it's like 850 billion. But there's all these pay fors attached to it. So in order to spend this $850 billion, we need to pay for it with there's like making welfare more efficient, which you might agree with, you might not. There's like cutting new tax enforcement from the IRS. There's $800 billion worth of pay fors in this bill. And that to me is just a distraction. Like
Mm.
there's no like in with defense spending or something, or you name it, there's never like a pay for. Um you don't if the government spends $1 trillion in defense, it doesn't say we need to, there's a corresponding $1 trillion in pay fors that we've come up with. And I think uh, the more people understand MMT, we'll be able to have more realistic conversations about what paying for stuff actually means.
Do
So if you were
you
to look at this infrastructure,
Yeah, do you think Republicans are aware? Like do you think like
I,
the actual sitting Congress members, the senators, all that kind of stuff, do you think that they're aware that they play fiscal conservative when it comes to like domestic spending, infrastructure, and all that kind of stuff, because they know that the old narrative is still popular with the American public, but then they
yep,
play the new game with military spending and their pet projects, because on one hand
yep.
they can tax richer people less, and get more of the pet projects while not necessarily investing in things that they care about. Do you think they're aware, or do you think it's like their actual philosophy?
I think it depends. I think that a lot of them believe it because the public believes it.
Hmm.
So like in order to get votes, you can't, I've actually talked to people that have tried to run for office with, explicitly on an MMT platform. And people think you're out of your mind if you say, we're going to spend $1 trillion without taxing $1 trillion. Like we don't have a plan to pay for it.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of it is just like they have to go. They're in kind of a trap where they have to go along with what the public perception of how tax and spend works. And but I think definitely a lot of them know it. And I mean, more people. I forget what the guy's name is, but the I believe it's the House Budget Committee chair, who's a Democrat, um, is starting to answer questions explicitly in MMT terms,
Hmm.
which is interesting. I do think that more of them are aware of this stuff than you'd think, but I think they have a very hard time going there publicly just because it sounds so wrong to in common sense
Well,
terms.
what are the so what are the warning signs? Because like so for instance, like that was kind of my thing is I was taught the old narrative about like fiscal policy, like you have to have a certain amount of taxes that has to be backed by a certain amount of value. If you spend too much, then you're going
Yep.
to devalue the currency. And
Yep.
basically, if there's no economic activity tied to a certain currency, then you can basically tank your own currency, and then you'll be walking around with fucking wheelbarrows of cash. And by the way, this is kind of like a side question: is like, how hard do you fucking laugh at fucking libertarians who like buy massive amounts of like silver and gold and they fucking like all that kind of shit? Because for me, it's like if you hoard silver and gold and then you need a piece of bread and you're out of bread, you're gonna give away
Yep.
fucking $7,000 worth of gold for a single loaf of bread. Like so, like so.
Oh, totally, totally, yeah. No. I mean, the gold standard stuff. It makes no sense. I think libertarians are drawn to it because they like the idea of a limited government that's their spending is fixed to the supply of gold.
Hmm.
But if go back to World War II, for example, what happens if FDR says, "Oh, you know what? We can't continue spending on the war because we don't have enough tax revenue, or we
Yeah.
can't
Oops.
we can't continue the New Deal because
Yeah. No, I'm laughing
you know what I
because
mean?
like
It's
yeah,
like
like people in Japan they're like or like who are like literally storming like the island of Okinawa and they're like, "Oh, sorry guys, we ran out of money. Good luck." Like
exactly,
here's some
exactly,
bayonets. Have
exactly,
fun.
right,
Yeah.
exactly, and like the gold thing is strange to me, the fascination with gold, but it is what it is. I just think that the whole point of the monetary system is to um, work towards public purpose, whatever that is. And I think if you can have an honest debate about it, so to me, what does an honest conversation look like in infrastructure? So much time is spent on, oh, how are we going to pay for this? What taxes are we going to raise? Who are we going to tax, etc. When it should really be, okay, what do we want to build? What problems do we want to address? Um, um, what it's what we were talking about earlier. Like, what does this society need? Not like, oh, we're going to make the IRS more efficient in order to pay for this bill because that's probably $100 billion a year. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I was actually curious about this because I was thinking about this.
Yep.
There are certain things that we need, or at least that I think that we need, and if you were to incorporate like Maslow's hierarchy of need as like a conception, like physiological needs, security needs, social needs, egotistical needs, whatever,
Yep.
self actualization, you can leave like the top tiers to the market, but then the bottom tiers, there's a certain amount of like reinforcement that you need to do. So, for instance, like oftentimes people complain about food subsidies in the United States of America, and to me, it's like food is like the one thing you definitely want subsidized because then
Yep.
it's cheap, it's available, it's there.
Yep.
Basically, you guarantee some level of logistical security. Food is definitely something that needs to be subsidized. And then talking
For
about
sure.
like security, law enforcement, EMTs, firefighters, all those kinds of people, those people should be
Yep.
paid because that's a certain amount of infrastructure. And then when it comes to
Yep.
socialization, teachers, right? Like we need to
Yep.
have a socialized society that understands each other, knows how to work together, like all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking to myself, like, even if you spent $10 trillion in the economy in order to fix all of these things tomorrow, these would be
Yep.
sunk in things like vehicles, body armor, guns, books, buildings, all that kind of stuff. So while the people who built these things did receive financial benefit, it would ultimately be sucked into materials and then sucked into fixed objects. And I was really trying to, like, in my own mind, like, if you just guaranteed that teachers were making like 60K a year or 70K a year instead of 50K a year, you're not they're not
Yep,
going to start going to the fucking strip club and just fucking, like making it rain. They're just going to pay their
for sure.
bills and maybe go on vacation. You know what I'm saying?
100%. Well,
Yeah.
1000%. And Social Security is the perfect example of that, right? I don't think anyone has a moral problem. I think very few people have a moral problem with Social Security. The gist of Social Security is when you're 65 and you've paid your dues, living in society, you get, you get to comfortably live until you die, basically. And I don't think there's any moral hazard in doing that. And that's just a decision we made. We said, okay, when you turn 65, you get enough money to pay your bills and live comfortably. Because do we really want 80-year-olds, having to work? Do we want 80-year-olds having to share income with their family? Do we want homeless 80-year-olds? And we made the decision, no, we don't want to do that. We're gonna, Social Security is a thing that we believe in. And the whole Social Security is insolvent thing is another, bullshit line that you hear. But that to me is the perfect example of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had a question about that. So, for instance, like, I think I saw that like Social Security is insolvent, and even my parents repeated that shit to me, where they're like, "I'm going to get Social Security,
Yep.
you're not." And then I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure that by
It's a
like
meme.
2050 or something like that, in order to keep
Yep.
it solvent with current pay rates, they would literally just have to like reduce payments by like 28% or something like that, and then they could keep it running for like another half century or something like that. So like, but then again, like with MMT, you're just saying like this is not going to tank the value of the currency if we actually just met our
No.
obligations.
Correct. And I mean, they could. So when you hear that Social Security is going to go insolvent, it could go insolvent under the current or legal arrangement we have for it.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a Social Security trust fund. Everyone pays taxes into this trust fund. That trust fund makes payments to Social Security recipients.
Mm-hmm.
All that is by design. Like all that is that's not like natural law that it has to happen that way. The government could stop collecting Social Security tax and still pay Social Security recipients without a problem. All they're doing, like literally all that's happening, is the government is changing numbers in your account at Bank of America, and then Bank of America is changing your account up. It's numbers on a spreadsheet.
Well,
There's no solvency concern there.
is there a ceiling? So for instance, like what I was kind of told was that
Yep.
we kind of like some of our debt is owed to foreign countries, and some of our debt is
Yep.
literally owed to ourselves. Literally, like like you said, deficit spending or something like that.
Yep.
But we pay, if I understand correctly, we pay some level of interest on our debt, even the interest on our debt to ourselves. Is
Yep.
that kind of like, is that arbitrary? Can the bank say like no interest, no payments,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. So that's all a policy choice too.
Mhm.
So I mean, even the government issuing debt is a policy choice. So it wasn't always the case on the gold standard. It made sense, to issue bonds. But basically, what bond issuance is today. So say you have $1,000 in your checking account. Okay,
Mhm.
all buying a bond is you're buying what's called a securities account at the Federal Reserve. That is essentially just shifting money from a checking account into a savings account. Securities account and savings account are the same thing. It's the easiest way to think about it. So your money is now in a savings account with the Federal Reserve that pays interest at a certain date. So if you buy, whatever, a bond, 5-year bond, 5%, when that bond comes due, they put your money back in your checking account with the added interest. And all that's happening there, it's not like the government's getting gold coins and then like passing you a gold coin. All they're doing is crediting your account plus interest. So when you hear this figure, I think the national debt's something like 24 trillion now. Let me
Yeah.
look it up. National debt.
Libertarians had a fucking boner in 2001 because if we kept paying our debts at the Bill Clinton fucking budgetary level, we would have actually had $0. We would have had a surplus or something like that, or we had a
Yeah,
budgetary
yeah, yeah.
surplus, but we wouldn't have had any
Yes.
debt if we had like run it till like 2011, and then 9
Right.
11 happened,
So
and George Bush was like, "Nah, we need to invade the entire Middle East and North Africa, so let's go do that instead."
yeah. So that's an interesting point. So national debt's 28.4 trillion. So what does that mean? That means there's 28.4 trillion in the savings accounts at the Federal Reserve. Whenever those accounts come due, whenever they're due, the government just ships that money back into a checking account and pays the interest on it. That's all that means. So
Mhm.
that debt figure is basically just savings accounts. The interesting thing about the surplus is so Clinton gets a lot of credit for the surplus, right?
Mhm.
Which all that means is that the government was taking in more revenue than it was spending, right? Which is actually a bad thing because that basically means you're sucking money out of the private sector um, more than you're putting in,
Yeah,
and
and kind
that,
of
like,
what
if you want to go into it
to
for
eliminate
no
a
reason.
debt account that you ultimately owe to yourself.
Yeah, because we kind of the common sense model of the government is that it's like a household and that it
Mhm.
needs to save in order to spend, or it needs to tax in order to spend, or borrow in order to spend. And that's where this virtue that, surpluses are a good thing. But all a surplus is the government is pulling more money out of the economy than it's putting in. And that is what leads to private debt in the private sector.
Well, okay, so I guess the question for me is though I kind of asked this a little bit earlier, but I'll ask directly again. So the nightmare scenario for the conservative fever dream, Red America, or what is it, like Wolverines? What is that? Red Dawn. The Red Dawn scenario
Yep.
is that
Yep.
China owes like 20% or 30% of our debt. We
Yep.
maybe own like 50% of it. We
Yep.
currently are at 28 trillion. By 2050, the economy is still only like 25 trillion a year or something like that. And then our deficit spending, because we just spend the way that we do, is 60
Yep.
trillion, 70 trillion, 100 trillion. And then
Yep.
China or whatever our debtors say, they're like, hey, we want to cash everything in right now,
Yep.
which doesn't make sense, but let's just go with the hypothetical. They
Yep.
say, we want to cash everything in right now because you're basically spending so much that our investment in your infrastructure isn't worth anything. And then
Yep.
we don't pay them, and then they come and try to fuck us in the butt. So
Right.
what do you
Okay.
feel? What do you feel about that?
So so all right. So just the China example, because that's the one that everyone
Well,
seems to go to.
and I just want to bring
So
this up as
China,
like a historical,
how does China?
as a historical example, like stuff like this has happened in the past, like I believe
Yep.
Egypt with the United Kingdom with the canal
Yep.
crisis.
Yeah. I don't know the particulars of that situation, but I'll
Mhm.
tell you. So China, for example, how does China get U.S. dollars in the first place?
I'm assuming they give some level of what's their dollar amount? They give some amount of dollar or value to the federal government in exchange for bonds.
They do, but how do they, like, so in order to get those dollars, like, where do those come from?
I'm assuming they're
So
do
say
if
say
they're
you're
on a
say
fiat
you're
currency. I'm assuming they do the same thing we do. They probably print that shit.
they do, but but in order to buy bonds, you need to have U.S. dollars in the first place. So
Interesting.
if there's Chinese if there's Chinese holders of U.S. debt, they had to get those dollars somehow.
Hmm.
How that typically works is, since we're a net importer from China, we buy all our shit from China. They manufacture all of it. So let's say you're a Chinese factory. You're manufacturing stuff for Walmart. Walmart's buying your goods. They deposit U.S. dollars into your checking account, which is actually in the U.S. banking system. And then, as that Chinese factory, you say, okay, I can hold on to this debt in my checking account, or I can I can buy a bond which pays me interest. So in this case, rather than just holding the cash, they decide to buy the bond. All that means, by owning the bond, so the Chinese factory in this case has created real goods and services for the United States, for U.S. customers. They've put people to work. They've created goods and services and sent them here. They got dollars in exchange. All that dollar is, that's now in a savings account or a bond, is just an account balance. And it says that on this date, the US government owes you your principal plus the interest. So if if a Chinese factory, if whoever holds the debt, if it's the Chinese government, whoever, all that they're owed is a statement that says, okay, you're owed, you now have this many dollars in your account. It's really not like it's not like this nightmare scenario. Would there be like macro effects of that happening? Absolutely. But it's not like an apocalyptic scenario that people paint it out to be. In
Well,
fact, they have risked more by putting their people to work and sending us goods, and all they got in return was a dollar balance.
Well, and I think that's the concern for Americans, in particular. Some of the economic anxiety of the white working class is
Yep.
that you know, basically, like, we don't seem to produce much here anymore. Oftentimes,
Yep.
if you look at our economy, the economic goods that we produce are oftentimes, they're either intellectual or
Yep.
they're reselling finished goods that have been purchased from overseas. So basically, like, we'll either purchase like raw materials overseas, but then
Yep.
oftentimes the raw materials either come here to become a finished good, or they hit 18 different fucking ports before they become
Yep.
synthesized into a finished good. They become a finished
Right.
good. It's shipped here, and then it's counted
Yep.
as a part of our GDP as a sold
Yep.
finished good. And so,
Yep.
with that, that's like terrifying to me because it seems like the only thing that we actually produce here is maybe like food and
Yeah.
intellectual property, which is like, that's based. I mean, that's fucking dope. But at the same time, like, it's really scary because like even during COVID, with a lot of like medical supplies being manufactured in China, those
Yep.
dollars didn't mean shit. And China was
Yep.
like, hey, we're gonna prioritize our own people because we actually manufacture this shit. So y'all are gonna have to
Yep.
wait until we're done. And I think
For
that's one
sure.
of the concerns for me, especially coming from like a security background, like a military background, is being reliant on other countries that might not necessarily prioritize us during a time of crisis. And that's what I wonder with the MMT thing is, if we completely hollow out our economy, we don't have any domestic production, and we're reliant, and we just say, and if we say some of the things that you said, where we just say like, hey, ultimately this is just like digital zeros and ones. We can change value how we feel it. We can invest in certain things. That way we, you know, we kind of enhance these programs and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like if somebody doesn't have their hand at the wheel in order to maintain us like before a crisis, then during a
Yep.
crisis we can back ourselves into a pretty hard corner.
I agree with that. I don't think that is again, I think that's like a political decision. Like it's a political decision to allow US businesses to manufacture overseas. And when you're talking about doing stuff that we need, like IV bags and like, PPE and all that shit, probably a bad decision to do that.
Hmm.
But, you know, through the MMT lens, we can say, all right, we're going to, we're going to invest in, let's call it health infrastructure in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to build, through either direct spending, through incentivizing the tax structure, we're going to build the facilities necessary so that if there is another pandemic, we don't have to rely on China to import these goods. And it's not about the financing, it's about the resources we have available to us, which is like, we're in a country where that's not really an issue. There are things that sure we would need to import, but we have a workforce, we have tons of raw materials, we have the ability to do it. I think there was actually a Keynes quote, and he said that anything we have the resources to do, we can financially afford, and that's a good way to think about MMT.
Yeah, and I was kind of wondering about that because I think that goes back to my earlier curiosity about just like economic productive activity. Like it doesn't
Yep.
really matter what, like, dude, if I fucking go to work tomorrow and I spend 8 hours doing something productive, and then in
Yep.
turn you give me something that allows me to feed myself, clothe myself, house myself, it doesn't matter what the fuck we call that. Like, we just have to
Yep.
make it happen. And that economic productivity needs to continue. One of the things, this is actually kind of a weird curveball, but I want to ask it. One of the
Yep.
things that was kind of frustrating going overseas, was I saw different economies and different modes of being in which economic productivity was not emphasized. So
Yep.
specifically, I'm thinking of I was in the Dominican Republic, and like this, I'm not necessarily saying this is anybody's fault. I'm just saying that this is the way it is. In
Yep.
particular, I went to a town called Guayabal. Guayabal is on the outskirts. There's no domestic infrastructure. There's no domestic, industry. There's no place to really commute to work, even if you wanted to. It's literally just like a rural
Yep.
town. The only thing that's growing there is like fucking what was it, like mangoes, and they didn't even have any mango groves. They were literally just like growing haphazardly all over the place, and we were doing stuff like building houses and all that kind of jazz. But really the only commerce in the entire town that I could see of was like one convenience store, and besides
Yep.
that there was just like thousands of unemployed or underemployed people um living with materials like literally the houses. Like when I say shacks, they were fucking shacks. Like they were literally
Yep.
like wood leaned up against wood and metal.
Yep.
And that's what they lived in. And so like for me, my not my fear, but one of the things that I was kind of wondering about was like how how if you're in that kind of situation, do you become productive? And then if the world was to get to that place where we were just like printing money and we're like, people need food, housing, shelter, so we're just going to build it for them. But then
Yep.
there's no corresponding economic activity or productivity that's like a lot that is created by that production. Does this get us into a quandary of MMT where you're throwing stuff in, but you're not getting anything out?
Yeah. So I think that's possible. I also so just to be clear, like MMT is not a proposal. It's just like a lens for looking at the world as it is.
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter. Like you can look at the United States through the MMT lens because like we're talking about how the United States actually operates. Like I'm not saying we should adopt MMT. There's no like doing MMT. MMT is basically just currency analysis. It's looking at how these different monetary systems are set up and what possibilities or impossibilities that means for that government. So in a situation like a developing country, for example, there are MMT academics who focus on how developing countries can utilize the understanding of MMT to develop their economies essentially. There's an academic named Fidel Kabub. He's a denizen, and he focuses on developing countries specifically through the MMT lens. There's another, I forget, there's another guy's name who gave a great talk at the MMT conference a couple years ago, but focused on Africa specifically and how can they use their currency systems to develop their countries. I don't know the particulars of all that. I just know that understanding how the economy works through the MMT lens opens a lot of doors for developing nations in a way that like the neoclassical economic sense, which is what you learn in college mostly, does not. So yeah, in terms of facilitating economic activity, I don't have like a great plan, but
Yeah,
the work is definitely being done by people.
and if I hear you correctly, it's not so much that like MMT opens up a philosophical doorway to look at like fiscal policy, monetary policy, and economic policy that
Yep.
that might allow us to be more productive than we already are, and reinforce infrastructure that presently does not exist in order to benefit the economy as a whole. But it can be misused as much as it can be used. So, for instance, like
Totally.
if you spent a lot of money in an economically unproductive situation, like literally just printed $10 trillion and handed it out to people, you
Yep.
could fuck up the economy. But if
one Hundred
but
percent.
but if alternatively you were like, I'm gonna print or I'm gonna print digitize like $10 trillion, but we're gonna use
Yep.
this as an investment in order to create roads, bridges, telecom, fiber, material
Yep.
goods that will actually physically exist in the economy that need some level of investment in order to exist. Then at that point, the we were talking earlier about like the blood effects of a body. Then
Yep.
you're basically talking about like almost like synthesizing new tissue. So that new tissue
Yep.
will absorb, some of that, like, I don't know, like financial liquidity.
Yeah. Well, think about the vaccine, for example.
Mhm.
The vaccine is a great example of this. Okay. Huge problem at societal level, right? Like we need a vaccine for this disease. Um, the government creates an incentive structure through spending to say the private sector, you are now incentivized. There's no risk of failure, basically. Like we're not going to rely on private markets for this. We're not going to rely on venture capital. It's too risky for venture capital, whatever. And the vaccine got done in like a year. It
Mhm.
wasn't left up to just like, market forces. It was a conscious decision by the state to facilitate the vaccine. Um, it's just like it's spending for public purpose. And then you think about like Medicare for all. So here's a good example. So Medicare for all, the way the insurance, the private insurance system is set up today, all the spending comes, and I think we were talking about this on Twitter. All the spending comes from individuals and businesses to go to say Aetna or whatever insurance company they've chosen, and so much is spent on just like decoding bills and like
Oh,
Aetna's
fucking
talking
kill
to
me.
doctors and Aetna's it's the worst, right? And Aetna's marketing their shit. Like a lot of that spending
Administrative,
just goes to administrative costs
dude.
for those businesses.
Insurance. I work. I'm not gonna say specifically what I do, but I work with insurance companies and I work with contractors. And
Yep.
oh my god, I've actually never, I've kind of never been more disgusted with capitalism. Don't worry, I'm not coming to the left. But I've kind of never been more disgusted because
Yep.
basically, we're talking about people who work with their hands. We're talking about people who work with, blood, guts, steel, cables, drywall, all that kind of stuff, working with their hands. And then we're also talking about people who need money, and the
Yep.
amount of money that can be earned by an individual who simply knows administration really well and simply knows
Yep.
how to facilitate these negotiations,
Yep.
they're incredibly profiting off of
Right.
simply facilitating and coordinating relationships that would probably exist regardless of their presence. And they're charging a
Right.
premium for that service. I'm not saying it's not
Yep.
necessary, but I am saying that like it does seem like it does seem like one place where like a lot of money is getting trapped almost.
Oh yeah. I mean, think about like these premiums that are going to like an Aetna and a Cigna or whoever.
Mm.
Like, think about all the shit they're spending on that is kind of unnecessary that is totally unnecessary for providing healthcare. You know what I mean?
Oh, it's
You're talking about
actually
advertising.
it's
It's absurd.
it's worse and better. And the worst part of it, so this is something that somebody schooled me on recently, was that insurance companies are basically like a mutual fund. So what they do is they pool all of the premiums that everybody has and they throw it into the market for investment. And then what they
Yep.
do is they return those profits back into the portfolio and continue to invest and continue to invest and continue to invest. And then they use actuaries, basically people who like predict loss and like all that kind of stuff, in order to predict what their liabilities are on an annual basis. So they know how much
Right.
that they're going to have to spend that year, or approximately know how much they're going to spend that year. So they're making money all over the place. They're making money on
Oh
people
yeah.
pooling their money. They're making money in the
Yep.
investment. If they have a really good year, they can pool that. Or they can pull
Yep.
that and kind of benefit themselves, and then they make money because then I mean, there are some companies that are way better than others, but then there are some companies that will fight tooth and nail on the back end. So when you say, "Hey, I gave you $3,000 a month for the past 2 decades. I need money in order to take care of a serious problem with my home or my business," then they get real
Yep.
stingy with it real quick because they want money on the front end
Sure.
and they don't want to give it to you on the back end.
For sure. This is one that kind of makes people's head spins. I don't know if this is true, but I've heard this. There's people in
Mm.
MMT that say this, that something like Medicare for all, if you were to go to some kind of universal system, and I don't know the particulars of it, but doing something like that would probably require a tax cut rather than a tax increase,
Hmm.
because so much money is put into these insurance companies. Those insurance companies are paying, billions or trillions out to their employees. So if you were to eliminate the insurance companies, That's tons of lost income for tons of people. And in order to make up for that deflationary event, you would need like a tax cut to stimulate the economy
Mm.
and move those people into the public sector to administrate just like a Medicare for all program. But there's tons of waste there. It's like being taxed, right? It's like being taxed. Like everyone needs health insurance, and instead of the current system, you could say, okay, we're going to invest. It's like Social Security. We're going to invest in our population. We want people to be healthy. We don't want our citizens going bankrupt because they get cancer. So we are going to invest in our population. And I think the only way you get there is if you have the MMT lens. Like you can't be talking about like pay fors for Medicare for all. You can't. And you
Well,
can't do it on the state level either.
yeah, and I kind of want to point this out too. So a lot of people talk about how expensive health insurance is. Oftentimes it's like end of life care, and oftentimes it's
Yep.
pretty quick. And what I mean by that is when people have like very aggressive cancer, when they have very aggressive disease, when they have heart disease and all that kind of stuff, typically once you're fucked up, you're fucked up. And it's really just a
Yep.
question of like postponing it. So there's a lot of costs that are taken on the back end.
Yep.
And so basically my only point with that is that I pointed this out on like debates. We spend, I want to say like the average developed nation spends 17% of their GDP on healthcare when they have like a public option, oftentimes with a multi-payer system.
Yep.
We spend about 24%. Now, bear in mind, there's other factors. We do R&D, we have administrative costs for private insurance. There's a whole reason why that number is inflated. But to pretend
Yep.
that like we're not even getting as good of a bang for our buck. And here's the other thing about working public and private sector too. I was told when I was in the public sector that public sector employees are lazy as fuck and they basically just like suck up money and don't do anything all day. I met people who were
Right.
lazy as fuck and I met people who were incredibly productive. And then what happened when I went to the private sector? I met people who were
Yep.
lazy as fuck and people who were incredibly productive. In the lazy as
For
fuck
sure.
people were sometimes more toxic because instead of like it would have been better if they were neutral. But sometimes they
Yep.
actively hurt the organization because they were so fucking toxic.
Yeah.
At least public service
Yeah.
employees they can be like neutral. Like at least they go to Applebee's and spend like $30 on their fries and like all that kind of stuff. The fucking private sector employees can
Right.
literally hurt the institutions they're a part of.
Yeah.
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 So
For sure. People are lazy people everywhere, no doubt.
yeah. Well, what else do you think we should cover? We got about a dozen people at home watching us now live, and I'm sure we'll get a few hundred during the actual one. And chat, if you're there, if there's any questions that you have, so Adam is little Twitter mutual friend of mine, economics guy, and he came on here to talk to us about MMT. I think I didn't go too hard on it. But if you have any questions in chat, then go ahead and throw them in there. Do at Counterpoints, and I'll answer them for you. And then while we're waiting for chat to get their shit together, because oftentimes they're not all together, are there any major points that you think are important to understand?
So I would like I said, I've said this a couple times, but I think the biggest thing I think it's important to remember about MMT, like what MMT is really trying to drive home, is that we should think about balancing. Well, this is what Stephanie Kelton says, who's like probably the leading MMT proponent, is we should think about balancing the economy, not balancing the budget. So instead of thinking about these policy proposals just in like dollar terms, we should be thinking about what are the outcomes we're going after and not just think about the costs. Like $1 trillion sounds like a ton of money, but what is that $1 trillion being spent on, and like what is the goal of spending the $1 trillion? And I think everyone should also know that that on the federal level, this is different for states. So like states can't do this. States can't. They're not currency they're not currency issuers. States do need to raise revenue in order to spend. So they do need to sell bonds. They do need to raise taxes in order to, if New York State wants to start Medicare for New York, they need to finance that by getting money. The federal government does not have that concern. So the federal government, all spending is new money created. All spending is literally just marking accounts up, and whoever's account it is, if they're buying airplanes, we're marking up Boeing's account. And if they're taxing, it's marking an account down. It's just like all it is numbers on a spreadsheet, basically. So the federal government, like I'm personally pretty progressive on the federal level, but pretty conservative on the local and state level because I don't, I see that like I think California is pitching some Medicare for all thing. It would just it can't work on the state level like that. So it's important to keep that in mind, the currency issuer versus the currency user.
That actually brought up an important question while you were talking. So I know the concern is basically maintaining productive economic activity, like while maybe doing MMT. So could the fiscal conservatism of like states and private institutions, would that be potentially where this could be balanced out? Where like kind of what I was saying is like as long as people wake up and do what they do on a day to day basis, if the state has to balance its budget, that gives some level of certainty. If private institutions
Yeah,
have to balance their budgets, there's some level of certainty. And if the federal
yeah,
government injects money into areas in which we don't see the inflation, but we do
yep,
see growth and infrastructure and investment and like all that kind of stuff, and if that money never hits your fucking checking account and you just keep going to work every single day, then
yeah.
is that kind of the balance of power that we can strike, where the Fed does what it wants as long as it's being smart, and then the states and private institutions can play the neoclassical game and kind of balance the
Yeah,
game out.
I think so. I think that's probably a good way to think about it. That at the state level, the governments are kind of kept in check by their fiscal restraints. And I would also say that a lot of the spending that's in place is kind of automatic. So this is not entirely just like at the whim of politicians. Like the reason we have automatic stabilizers, as they're called, in place is like we don't want to go into a deflationary spiral where if everyone loses their jobs all of a sudden, um, people stop spending money. Where you're talking about a depression. So we've put measures in place that happen automatically. So if you lose your job, you can collect unemployment. If you lose your job, like there's some level of the welfare state that's in place already that is not just like the whims of politicians, which I think is something that's important to keep in mind. It's not like all these decisions are just being made, one off, like a stimulus bill. Um, it's that this stuff is in place to stabilize the economy,
Okay.
and it happens automatically.
Well, then we're gonna spend a
Are
second.
there any questions in chat?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm gonna try to answer them and then see if I learned anything over the past hour, and you can criticize anything I get wrong. So,
Okay, cool.
Table Flipper says, when can spending go too far? And I'll try to be brief, and then you kind of tell me if I got it right or wrong. So
Sure.
what you were kind of saying, if I understand you correctly, is that if we spent money in an aggressive way, kind of in the stupid ways that I brought up, where we just dump money into the economy, or
Yep.
if we don't invest in like real goods or something that would actually be productive for the economy, then we can create inflation because we're just throwing money at economic productivity that doesn't exist and doesn't manifest. That was
Yep.
my understanding of it.
Yeah. So what you'll often hear in MMT is that inflation is the constraint to spending. So say the government tomorrow says we're going to spend $1 trillion on concrete, and concrete prices go through the roof, and the private sector no longer has access to concrete, then that's probably not a good idea to spend $1 trillion on concrete.
Okay. Then Truth Lie asks, so as long as MMT is used to drive people to engage, this is kind of repeating the same question, but it's
Yep.
gonna flow into another one. Basically, if they invest in businesses that produce real goods, or I would say the government that produces real goods, then we won't see an inflationary spiral.
Uh, do you want to go first, or do you want me
No, you
to
go.
respond?
You go. I'm not touching that
Okay.
shit.
I would Yeah, I would say that's accurate. It's hard to like make generalizations, but I would say that that's accurate. I think as long as as long as the government is, and listen, there are times when maybe you do want to facilitate competition between the private sector and the public sector,
Mhm.
like minimum wage, for example. Or let's say the government. Um, so one thing you'll hear about is the job guarantee. So basically, let's say the government wanted to hire all unemployed people at $15, okay, and they could afford to do that. MMT tells us that we know they could afford to do that. Suddenly, people who are making $0 per hour are making $15 an hour. In order to get them out of the public sector, the private sector needs to offer them $18 an hour, let's say.
Hmm.
So the question is not can we afford to do that? It's is that something we should be doing? Is that an environment we want to create? Like, would that be good for the public? Would that be good for people, basically? So the question, like I said, the question is not about like the financial constraints of the government. The question is the policy something we want to pursue?
Yeah, and this flows right into what I think is actually an interesting question. Um, basically, like how does UBI factor into this? Because as the person Jesus points out, is that with
Yep.
UBI there isn't necessarily new economic activity. There's just
Yep.
new money being dispersed. So does
Right.
MMT and UBI flow into each other? Are they contradictory, or is it complicated?
It's a little bit complicated, but generally the MMT academics, like the high level MMT people, are pretty anti UBI
Mm-hmm.
because they say that it, it basically could fuck up the whole system, right?
Mm.
Because you're basically saying the dollar, like the dollar is no longer anchored to anything. So if you can collect money for doing nothing, then like that's the price of money, basically. So the proposal I just mentioned, the job guarantee,
Mm.
is what you'll hear most MMT people be in favor of. So people that are willing and able to work, basically instead of the base case for them being $0 per hour. So let's say there is a financial crisis, 20% of the country loses their jobs. The idea is that there'd be a job guarantee. They'd be administered locally but funded federally, where they'd pay $15 an hour, let's say $10, $15 an hour, whatever. And so let's say like I live in New York. Let's say New York City has a job guarantee office, and suddenly rather than just collecting checks, people can go to this office. They can get jobs cleaning parks, caring for the elderly, caring for sick people, you name
Nice.
it, and they get paid $15 an hour. That is counter cyclical, right? So suddenly these people do have income rather than just losing their income.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing something for the economy, right? So they're caring for others. They're doing stuff that otherwise probably wouldn't be being done, or it's being done for free. Um, versus, and then when the economy recovers, then they ideally transition back into the private sector. So side note here, the benefit of that is like if you look at unemployment data after recessions, a lot of people that lose their jobs initially never go back into the workforce. That happened after '08, and it'll happen this time too,
Mm.
because for various reasons. And a lot of time it's because employers don't want to hire people who lost their jobs. Like, it's much easier to hire people who they're a good employee, you're not taking a risk on them, so you'd rather hire them away than hire someone who's been unemployed for 2 years. So the job guarantee eliminates that ideally. So long story short, yes, UBI is possible. Like, we could send people checks.
Mm.
It would probably screw up the whole system, and generally MMT people are not in favor unless that person like physically cannot work. But that's the answer essentially.
Then what I heard is Andrew Yang is an asshole. That's what I heard.
Yeah, and I'm not a Yang guy. Yeah,
Gotta get that bag. But no, that's actually
yeah,
that is fairly interesting though, because if we're applying simplistic rules, and I'm sorry for continually applying them, I know it's
no
more
worries.
complicated than this. But at the same time, like if we're applying simplistic rules, then it would make sense that it would be better for people to be contributory, economically productive, and all that kind of stuff. So if they did that in a private
Yep,
sense or a public sense, it kind of doesn't matter as long as there's some material or service good that's derived, and then it'll be kind of like deflated. Whereas if you just throw
yep,
cash into people's hands, then
yep,
basically it's going to fuck up the proportion of what's being done.
yes,
So I'll try to set that in my head, because I think that's a pretty cool way to balance. And then I think I just
yep,
have one more comment, but it's not necessarily a question. I'll just check it out. A decent example is right now with
sure,
unemployment, people are getting money and stimulus, so there's a shortage of goods being produced. That's why we're getting inflation, supply chain issues. Oh yeah, so that's actually I'll ask you a question.
yep,
So like lumber has tripled in price. We had that
Mm.
inflationary spike in April. And what
Yep.
Jesus over here is saying is that basically because we have a combination of stimulus, unemployment, and underemployment, there's normally things that are
Yep.
being produced, but they're not being produced right now. So the inflationary pressure is not coming from the financial side with money being produced. It's actually coming from the supply chain issues because of supply and demand. Does that line up
Correct.
with your earlier conversation about like Uganda, Venezuela, all that kind of stuff? Is that the
Yeah.
logistics chains have been broken, so now things are fucked up?
That's right. That's right. So yeah. So there are a lot of things in the economy that were thrown off by COVID, like supply chains, and that fucks everything up. That sends like price shocks through the whole economy,
Mm,
right? So um, like basically, like Milton Friedman made everyone believe that the quote from Milton Friedman that everyone knows is inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And
okay.
the implication there is that anytime you see inflation, it's because the government is doing something with the money supply. And that is really what's stuck in like the like people's psyches. It's stuck for, 50 years now.
Mm,
And you really like so lumber, for example, you really have to look at it's not just the government spending money that caused the price of lumber to go up. There's a million factors. People tons of people are buying homes. Uh, there's supply chain shortages. There's, maybe factories are shut down because of COVID.
mm.
So it's a supply shortage and the demand is causing the price to spike. You got to look at this stuff like it's not as simple as just saying, oh, there's more dollars out there and more dollars means more competition for goods and that's the end of story. It tends to be more complicated.
Well, and so okay, so this actually this is an important question that I think tail ends on that, just so we can understand economic collapses and inflationary spikes in the past. Using
Yep.
Venezuela as an example, if I understand what happened there correctly, and feel free to correct me. Basically,
Yep.
they went to not necessarily like a mono product, but kind of a mono product when it comes to their economy. They relied on gasoline
Mhm.
and petroleum
Yep.
extremely hard.
Yep.
And then they guaranteed the rest of their economy based off of the value that they expected out of that. Some economic redistributive policies were based off of like nationalization. And then, if I understand what
Yep.
happened in Venezuela correctly, was that because they kicked out all these large oil companies, a lot of oil companies stopped working with the Venezuelan government and basically boycotted them experientially. Venezuela didn't have the ability to produce gasoline the way that they used to, and on top of that, their product is extremely crude. Like it actually has to be cut
Yep.
with Middle Eastern and North
Yep.
African oil in order to be available. And because we're boys with everybody except for Iran, we kind of conspired to fuck their economy in its ass. Now that being said,
Yep.
they did themselves no favors by setting up a redistributive economy based off of like a mono commodity. But then that would get into if you don't have multiple investments simultaneously, domestic agriculture, domestic food production, domestic security, domestic, what would you call it, like IT, domestic computers,
Yep.
domestic, all that kind of stuff. Then because it's not necessarily the oil that fucked you, it's the fact that you only used oil as the basis of your economy, and then you tried to use that in order to buy other goods that you had no
Mhm.
domestic production for, and then because your oil got fucked
Yep.
up, everything else got fucked up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of the situation. That high level, that sounded right to me.
Hmm.
I think that like the important point is that if you look at any of these hyperinflationary events, there was something fucked up with the real resources in that economy. And there was something very real that went wrong.
Hmm.
So Zimbabwe, Weimar, you name it. And then typically the money printing is what came after the inflation. So prices are going up, people can't afford shit anymore. The government panics and starts spending money to basically like satiate the needs of the economy. And you get hyperinflation because and that's a consequence of the real resource issue, and
Hmm.
that is typically what happens or what has happened in these scenarios.
So if I'm president for a day or dictator for a couple of years, it
Yep.
is more important to have a diversified and productive economy than it is necessarily for me to worry about how much money I'm printing, and to make sure that that relationship stays on balance between printing money, economic investments, military spending, and the amount of productive behavior that is going on in the economy. So no one domino falling takes out the entire system.
Yeah, for sure. You're trying to build a well-rounded economy and well-rounded society.
How do you think we're
Like
doing with that?
even, I mean, I think
Because
I think
honestly, if a
there's
solar
room
flare comes out and takes
for
out all our fucking computers, we are fucked. We have so mmany people
yeah,
who don't know how to fucking grow
for sure. I mean,
tomatoes.
for sure. I mean, we like who knows what happens. I mean, cl- climate change. Like, are we prepared for that? Are we prepared for like all these cybersecurity issues? Is there shit we should be investing in to prevent catastrophe in those areas? I don't know. I'm not an expert on that stuff, but
Hmm.
I do know that financially, yeah, it's 100% possible.
Okay. All right, awesome.
Yeah.
Well, hey, we've been running for even with the late start, we've been running for about 90 minutes now. I want you to shout out whatever you want to shout out, and then I want to say for me, whatever Adam shouts out, go ahead and follow him because whenever somebody DMs me on Twitter, hey, can I talk, like all that kind of stuff, I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea if they're going to be cool, if they're going to be assholes, or if they're going to be insane or whatever. And like we've been incredibly lucky on this channel to just talk to fucking stand up, smart, interesting, cool people. And I definitely consider this conversation one of them because we were able to go deep, maybe a little bit too deep for some people. But at the same time, I feel like I have a better understanding about it. I'm not going to meme as
Good.
much. I feel like I'm going to talk about productive variables. I'm less likely to buy gold and silver, although I probably will still buy guns and ammunition. And then I think one of the things that we really have to start trying to hold our political leaders accountable for is they can't hollow out our economy and then just use fiscal stimulus on the back end to make up for it.
Yep.
These investments have to make sense and have to basically they have to create more economic production in order for us to maintain the balance of power. So with that, please shout yourself out.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. I know it's been a while. We've been talking about this, so thanks for. I'm glad we made it happen. I would say so. You can follow me on Twitter, Adam A. Rice. I'm not tweeting a ton these days. Trying to take a little step back from social media, but um, if you are interested in MMT, um, Stephanie Kelton on Twitter. She wrote a great book called The Deficit Myth about a year ago. I highly recommend. Um, Randy Ray, WRAY, another good guy to follow, and Warren Mosler. Those are my three favorite MMT follows. And then there's an organization that I'm a part of called Deficit Owls. It's a YouTube channel actually and a Twitter account. Tons of good MMT content and tons of explainer videos in like short bites. So like if you want an intro to MMT that's 10 2-minute videos, that's the place to go. And that's called Deficit Owls. And we're actually we're trying to get more involved with the streaming community like this, so we can talk to people that aren't already familiar with MMT. So great place to go. And thanks for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my sincere pleasure. So, guys in the chat, we're gonna dip out. I'm gonna end the stream. I'm probably just gonna talk to Adam for another couple of seconds. Thank you for coming and hanging out with us for the past like 90 minutes. I really do appreciate it. I wish you guys well. And we'll catch you soon. Have a great one. Bye. All right, and we are no